Mom, your badge is red again. Eli King said it quietly, the way he said most things. It was 11:40 p.m. at the staff entrance of the major airport serving the Denver metro area, the start of Rosanna King's 10th winter working nights on the ramp. She tapped her badge against the reader a second time. Red again. Behind the glass, the concourse lights of Meridian Ground Partners operation stretched toward the gates, a ground services operator that, as of 6 weeks ago, belonged to Corvair Holdings, a parent company running 11 airport stations and roughly 4,000 workers. A group of visiting executives from Corvair was just coming out through the same door, coats still creased from travel, and station manager Glenn Ferguson walked in front of them like a tour guide. Before we move on, I want to know who's with me today. Type your city and your local time in the comments. Now let's go back to that airport. Glenn saw the red light before Rosanna could say anything. He raised his voice enough for the smoke break crew near the bollards to hear every word. Your access changed, King. Your position moved to the contract roster. Contract roster uses the visitor entrance, same as everybody else without staff clearance. Rosanna kept her hand flat on the reader as if the machine might change its mind. She said she had walked through this door for 10 years. Glenn looked at the tablet in his hand, then back at her. The system says 2. One of the executives stopped walking. He was younger than the others, maybe mid-30s, and he studied Rosanna longer than a stranger should. Glenn introduced him, quickly and with too much polish, as Rovin Wong, the new chief executive of Corvair Holdings. Rosanna nodded the way you nod at any name you will never need again. She did not recognize him. Rovin Wong looked at her a moment longer, at the badge, at the boy beside her, and then he followed the other executives to the waiting cars. He did not intervene. A worker by the bollards looked away. Someone's phone stayed raised a little too long.
Would you challenge 10 erased years in public or take the visitor door and stay quiet? Let's continue to this story.
Rosanna used the visitor entrance that night, but she wants you to understand something the smoke break crew already understood. This was never about a door. A red badge meant the system had re-entered her 10 years as 2. Somewhere in the service record migration to Corvair's platform, her first 8 years had been attached to a staffing vendor, a company she had never heard of and never signed anything with. And under the transition terms posted in the break room, the difference between 10 years and 2 was not pride. 5 years of continuous service qualified a worker for a staff contract. 2 years put a worker on the contract roster. Eli walked beside her toward the visitor line, and he asked the only question that mattered to him. If they fix it, do I keep my doctor? She told him yes. She did not know yet if that was true. The doctor was his audiologist, the one who had fitted his hearing aids when he was 6 and had adjusted them every year since. The staff family health plan covered the aids, the visits, and the replacement ear molds he had outgrown. The fitting was already scheduled, 5 weeks out. The contract roster carried no family coverage at all. That was the first stake and the biggest one, and Rosanna understood it before she reached the front of the visitor line. The second stake was quieter but almost as heavy. Rosanna had chosen nights 10 years ago because the differential paid more and because nights let her be standing at the school door every afternoon at pickup. Fixed nights were the frame the whole household hung on. The contract roster assigned shifts through an app week to week, any hours the algorithm wanted. The neighbor who used to watch Eli had moved out 2 weeks earlier, which was why he now did his homework in the crew lounge until her first break, his hearing aid case sitting on the table next to his math workbook. There was no version of app-assigned shifts that kept that arrangement alive. The third stake belonged to Eli alone. He had been accepted into the Front Range Youth Aviation Mentorship, a program run through the Regional Airport Authority, and the acceptance letter had been on the refrigerator for a month. The liability form required a parent with a staff contract at the airport. Rent was behind too, but Rosanna had stopped counting that as news. She had 12 days before the transition roster became final. She started where any reasonable person would start. Scheduling told her the badge only reflected the roster, and the roster came from HR. HR meant Tasnim Ballard, the transition HR director, a careful woman with a clean desk and 11 stations worth of deadlines. Tasnim pulled up the record and turned the monitor so Rosanna could see it. The system showed her hire date as the date of an agency contract 2 years back. The earlier years were coded to a vendor called TSL Staffing Group, which no longer existed. Tasneem was not unkind about it. She simply said the system could only honor what the system contained. Payroll was worse because payroll agreed with her and still could not help. A clerk confirmed that older files had existed once, but records were archived out of the active system after 7 years and were not retained. Rosanna asked the clerk to check again. The clerk repeated that the older files were unavailable and apologized and meant it, which somehow made the wall feel thicker. Glenn Ferguson, who had run the station for 8 years, told her he could not personally verify years he had not supervised. She had trained 2 of the day supervisors he relied on. He did not mention that, and neither did she, because it would not have changed the tablet in his hand. Then HR called her back in, and Tasneem made the offer. If Rosanna signed an acknowledgement form accepting the 2-year service date, the company would waive her reapplication step for the contract roster and flag her for scheduling priority. It was framed as a kindness, a way to protect the shifts she still had. Tasneem slid the form across the desk with a pen on top of it. Rosanna picked up the form, read it twice, folded it in half, and put it in her jacket pocket without signing. Tasneem reminded her that priority was only available before the roster locked. Rosanna said she understood and left the pen on the desk. Upstairs, in a briefing Rosanna would not learn about for weeks, the badge incident reached Rovin Wong as a single line in a transition summary. One scheduling grievance among several hundred across 11 stations, pending standard review. He accepted the summary. He had 4,000 employees migrating onto one platform and a board watching the calendar. He did not ask anyone to pull the file. He did remember the woman at the staff door. He was sure he knew her face, but he let the certainty sit unexamined, the way busy people file things they intend to return to. By Thursday, someone's phone had done what phones do. The clip of the badge confrontation, the system says 2, was on 3 platforms, cut to 15 seconds, Glenn's voice crisp and Rosanna's face very still. At school, a kid in Eli's grade played it for him at lunch and called his mother the 2-year veteran. Eli did not tell Rosanna about the nickname. She found out anyway, the way mothers do, because that night, while she packed her lunch for the shift, she noticed the refrigerator door. The mentorship acceptance letter was no longer on it. Eli had folded it into his desk drawer under his spelling lists. He said the program probably wouldn't take his form anyway, so it didn't need to be up there. He said he was not hungry and closed his lunch container. Rosanna looked at the clock because the visitor line took 11 minutes longer and her shift started the same time it always had. So here is the second question, and it is the one Rosanna asked herself standing in that kitchen. She had 12 days. She could sign the acknowledgement, take the scheduling priority, and protect what was left. Or she could spend those 12 days chasing proof of employment that payroll said no longer existed, held by a vendor that no longer existed, in a system that had already decided who she was. Would you sign to save what you still had? Or would you go looking for a record nobody believes was kept? Rosanna took the folded form out of her jacket, set it in the kitchen drawer under the takeout menus, and decided to search. Rosanna started with what she could reach from her own kitchen table. She had 2 hours between school drop-off and the sleep she needed before the night shift, and she spent the first morning logged into the employee portal, scrolling backward through everything the system would show her. The portal's history stopped cleanly at the agency contract date 2 years back, as if she had been born that day. Pay stubs older than that had lived in an old webmail account she had stopped using when the provider changed hands. She spent 40 minutes on password recovery, before the recovery number turned out to be a phone she'd replaced 3 phones ago. The paper trail at home was thinner than she expected. She found tax returns going back 6 years in a shoebox, but the older W-2s named TSL Staffing Group as the employer, the same vendor code the migration had used. Whoever had built that vendor assignment had built it on something real enough to survive a tax form, which made it worse, not better. She found a training notice for de-icing certification from 7 years ago, but it was addressed from a generic operations email with no company letterhead. She found a luggage tag, a parking pass, and a Christmas card from a co-worker who had moved to Phoenix. None of it proved continuous service under the original operator, Meridian Ground Partners, and continuous service was the only phrase the transition rules cared about. She called the state unemployment office to ask about old wage records and sat on hold for 50 minutes before a recording told her to apply in writing, with a response time of 6 to 8 weeks. She had 11 days. She wrote the request anyway and mailed it, because leaving any door unopened felt careless, then crossed it off the list of things that could save her. That night at work, she asked 2 long-timers on the ramp if they had kept anything from the old operator. One had a 10-year service pin somewhere in a garage. A pin had no name on it, no number, no date. It proved someone had worked 10 years. It did not prove who. The next afternoon, Eli sat at the kitchen table doing homework while she went through the shoebox a second time. His hearing aid case was open beside his workbook, and he was cleaning the left aid with the little brush the audiologist had given him, careful and practiced, the way he did every Tuesday. He asked if the appointment in 5 weeks was still happening. Rosanna said the appointment was still on the calendar, which was true, and he went back to his brush, and she went back to a shoebox that had nothing left in it. She noticed the ear mold no longer sat flush the way it used to. He hadn't complained about it. That was somehow the part that stayed with her through the whole shift. It was at work, near 2 a.m. on the 4th night, that the memory surfaced. She was walking a lavatory cart past the standby desk on Concourse B, a route she had walked several thousand times, and the desk caught her eye the way familiar things sometimes do when your mind is worn down to the essentials. She had stood at that desk once, years ago, filling out paperwork in the middle of the night. Not company paperwork, airport paperwork. In 10 years, Rosanna had filed exactly 1 irregularity report. She remembered it because the shift supervisor at the time had grumbled about the extra form. Any incident involving a passenger escort outside normal boarding areas had to be documented, not for the company, but for the airport itself. The Regional Airport Authority, the Front Range Airport Authority, required irregularity reports for operational and regulatory review, and it kept them in its own records office. Not in company payroll, not in the migrated system, not in anything Corvair Holdings had touched. She had signed that form with her name and her employee number, and she had handed it to someone who did not work for her company. The next morning, instead of sleeping, she drove to the Airport Authority's administration building, a gray office block near the long-term parking lots that most ramp workers never had a reason to enter. The records clerk at the counter was a patient man who explained that irregularity reports were retained for regulatory purposes, and that individuals named in a report could request a copy of it with photo ID and a written form. He could not search by her name across all reports. The request had to be reasonably specific. What year was the incident? Rosanna stood at the counter and realized she did not exactly know. Early. Her first winter, she thought, or close to it. The clerk gave her the form and told her a broad date range would slow the search, possibly past a week. She wrote down a 14-month window covering her first winter and part of her second, paid the copy fee in cash, and went home to sleep 4 hours before the night shift. 3 days went by. The roster deadline dropped from 11 days to 7. She called the records office once and was told, politely, that the request was in the queue. On the seventh night, she came home at 8:20 a.m., signed Eli's field trip form, and found a voicemail from the records office asking her to come in. The clerk had the report waiting in a manila folder, one photocopied page, and he slid it across the counter face up. It was ordinary. That was the first thing she registered. How ordinary it was. A standard irregularity form, filled out in her own younger handwriting, documenting a passenger escort. Time of incident, 2:15 a.m. A stranded passenger with no funds, missed connection, trying to reach his mother, who was hospitalized 1,100 miles away. Employee escorted passenger from Concourse B to the standby desk and remained until agent assistance was confirmed. Her signature at the bottom, her employee number in the box at the top, the same number printed on the red badge in her pocket right now, and the date, stamped by the authority's intake clerk 9 years and 11 months before the transition roster was set to close. She stood at the counter and read her own employee number twice, because a number cannot be a coincidence and cannot be reissued backward through time. The report was not a confession, not a contract, not anyone's secret. It was one page of routine paperwork that the company had never controlled and the migration had never touched, and it put her number and her signature on that concourse almost 10 years ago. She thanked the clerk. She asked for 2 more certified copies. On the way to the car, she sat behind the wheel for a minute without starting the engine, holding the folder flat on her lap so the page would not bend. The report solved her problem in principle and left one question hanging over it. How had 8 of her years ended up coded to a vendor in the first place? A typo touches one field. A vendor code touching 8 years of one worker felt like a process, and processes rarely run once. The next day, she went back to the records office and asked whether the authority kept anything documenting the record migration itself. The clerk checked, and it did. When Corvair consolidated badge and access records, the authority had received a migration index for airfield credential holders, because badge access was the authority's business, even when employment was not. The index was releasable in redacted form. Employee numbers and dates, no names. Rosanna took the printout to the food court, bought a coffee she never drank, and read down the columns with a pencil. Her own employee number appeared with a reassignment entry, original operator code out, TSL staffing group vendor code in, 1 migration date. Then she started marking every line that matched that pattern. Same vendor code, same date. She expected a handful. The pencil kept moving. By the bottom of the 3rd page, she counted the marks twice because the first count seemed wrong. 31 employee numbers, all reassigned to the same vendor code on the same date in the same batch. She recognized the shape of some of the numbers. The older ranges, the series issued a decade ago. Night shift ranges. People hired the year she was hired. Rosanna sat with the pencil still in her hand and thought about the acknowledgement form folded in her kitchen drawer, and about the scheduling priority Tasnim had offered her for signing it, and about how reasonable that offer had sounded to someone with a shoebox full of nothing. 30 other people had gotten some version of that offer. 30 other people had faced the same clean monitor showing the same clean system, most of them without a 2:15 a.m. form sitting in a building they had never entered. She wondered, quietly and without any way to know, how many of them had already signed away their years because they could not prove those years had ever existed. She put the migration index in the folder behind the irregularity report and drove home to sleep before the shift. 6 days left. Rosanna made her first formal move on the 6th day. She scanned the irregularity report and the migration index, attached them to a records dispute request in the transition portal, and asked HR to correct her service date before the roster locked. Then she went to work and moved bags for 8 hours because the night shift did not pause for pending disputes. The company's first response arrived before her dispute did. When she stopped by the airport authority's records office to ask a follow-up question, the clerk told her, apologetically, that access procedures had changed that morning. Corvair Holdings had formally requested that archive lookups touching company personnel records be routed through authorized company representatives during the transition period. The clerk was careful to say her existing copies were hers, certified, released, done. But there would be no more browsing the index. The door she had found was now a door with a sign-in sheet, and her name was not on the list of people allowed to sign. The second response came on the schedule board. Glenn Ferguson reassigned her remaining nights to the remote de-icing pad, the far position out past the cargo aprons, a 15-minute crew van ride from the terminal. The pad had a heated trailer, a radio, and no crew lounge. There was nowhere for Eli to sit with his homework until her first break, which meant there was no version of the old arrangement at all. Rosanna knocked on the door of a neighbor 2 floors down, a woman named Jamie Lee Small, whom she knew from the mailboxes and one conversation about a leaking radiator, and asked if Eli could stay there on shift nights. Jamie Lee said yes, kindly, and Rosanna paid her what she could, and Eli packed his backpack and his hearing aid case and slept the first night on an unfamiliar couch. He said the couch was fine. He checked the case twice before he zipped the bag. The third response came by email from Transition HR, with Tasnim Ballard's name at the bottom. It noted that internal roster and personnel data were confidential, that distributing such information could violate company policy, and that policy violations could affect transition-related payments, including severance eligibility. It did not name the migration index. It did not need to. Rosanna read it twice, saved it to a folder, and did not reply. The fourth response was not from the company at all, which somehow made it land harder. The Front Range Youth Aviation Mentorship Office returned Eli's liability form unprocessed with a printed slip explaining that the parent employment section could not be verified while her staff contract status was listed as unresolved. They were not unkind either. Nobody in this was unkind on paper. Eli took the returned form from her hand, looked at it for a moment, and put it in the same desk drawer as the acceptance letter under the spelling lists. Then came the lobby. Rosanna had come in early to hand-deliver her dispute copies to the HR office upstairs, and Eli was with her because Jamie Lee had a doctor's appointment. Glenn crossed the terminal lobby with a clipboard, saw them near the escalators, and did not lower his voice. He told her the dispute was a waste of the company's time and hers. She said the report spoke for itself. Several employees on their way to shift change had slowed without quite stopping, and one of them already had a phone out from texting. 10 years of nobody noticing you isn't a record, Glenn said. It's a reason. Nobody gasped. One employee looked at the floor. A woman by the departures board stopped mid-sentence and did not finish it. The phone that was already out stayed raised a few seconds longer, and by that evening the clip had traveled farther than the badge video ever had, because cruelty travels better than confusion. Eli watched Glenn walk away and asked quietly what a reason meant. Rosanna said it meant Glenn was wrong in a complete sentence and left it there. The formal rejection of her dispute arrived the next morning. Tasneem's office acknowledged the irregularity report was authentic and authority issued, then declined to act on it. Employee numbers, the response said, may have been reissued or remapped during system migrations over the past decade. The number on a 10-year-old form could not be conclusively tied to the current holder of that number without a corroborating employment link. Rosanna read the sentence 3 times. The company had lost the records that would corroborate her and was now citing the absence of those records as the reason her record didn't count. So she went looking for the corroborating link. She remembered a night crew safety award from her early years, a photographer, a handshake, a paper certificate she had lost in a move. Awards meant newsletters. The old Meridian Ground Partners staff newsletter had been printed, not just emailed, and the airport's employee resource room kept a shelf of station history binders nobody had touched in years. She spent a morning she should have spent sleeping going through them, and in a winter issue from 9 years back, she found it. a dated photograph of the Night Crew Safety Award, 11 workers in high-visibility vests, and Rosanna King, third from the left, name printed in the caption. She submitted it as a supplement to her dispute. The response took 2 days and conceded even less than she feared. The photograph, HR wrote, established her presence at the station on that date, but did not establish her employment classification. Agency-placed workers routinely appeared in station photographs and crew events. She had proved she existed. They wanted proof of what she was. Only one kind of person could give them that: someone who had done the hiring. Rosanna sat down and wrote out the names of every supervisor from her first 2 winters. Most had scattered. One had died. But the man who had actually hired her, who had run night operations her entire first 3 years, was Brody Donnelly. And a retired ramp agent she still played cards with once a month knew exactly where Brody lived. 40 minutes north, in a small house with a flag on the porch and a wood shop in the garage. Brody was 71, slower than she remembered, and he knew her face before she reached the porch steps. He had seen the lobby clip. His granddaughter had shown it to him. He let her in, made coffee, and listened to the whole thing without interrupting. And when she finished, he went out to the garage and came back with a banker's box that smelled like sawdust. Inside were printed shift bid sheets from the original operator, the paper bids the night crew used to fill out twice a year before everything went digital. Brody had kept his supervisor copies out of habit, then out of stubbornness, then because throwing out 30 years of anything felt wrong. They went through them at the kitchen table, and there she was, winter of her first year. Rosanna King, her employee number, the assignment column reading night, continuous, and Brody Donnelly's signature in the supervisor box. The same number as the irregularity report. The same number as the red badge in her pocket. Name, number, classification, and the man who signed it, all in one place for the first time. Brody agreed to write a statement and to be available if anyone called. He said it plainly, like a man confirming lumber measurements. Rosanna drove home with photographs of every relevant sheet and, for one evening, believed the hard part was over. The day before the transition town hall, Brody called her. His voice had changed. That morning, he had received a reminder notice from the retiree health administrator, which he had learned at the bottom of the letterhead was managed under Corvair Holdings now too. The notice cited the non-disparagement clause in his retirement agreement and reminded retirees that violations could affect continued eligibility for retiree health benefits. It did not mention Rosanna. It did not have to. "I'm 71, he said. "That coverage is my heart medication. It's my wife's knee. I want to help you, Rosanna. I can't sign my name to this." He apologized twice. She told him she understood, and she did understand, which was the worst part. She sat in the parking lot of Jamie Lee's building afterward, engine off, the photographs of the bid sheet still on her phone, authenticated by a witness who could no longer afford to exist. So here is the third question, and it is not a comfortable one. Brody owed Rosanna nothing but a memory. If confirming someone else's employment history could put your own retirement health coverage at risk, your medication, your spouse's surgery, would you sign your name anyway? Or would you make the same call Brody made? The town hall was in 18 hours. Rosanna did not sleep that night, but she did not spend it the way despair usually spends a night. Around 1 a.m., sitting at the kitchen table with cold tea, she realized she had been arguing for a week against documents she had actually read and was now surrendering to a document she had never seen. Brody had told her what the notice said the clause meant. Nobody had shown her the clause. She texted Brody at 6:30 a.m. and asked one favor that cost him nothing: a photograph of the retirement agreement pages the notice cited. He sent them an hour later, 4 phone pictures of dense paragraphs, slightly tilted. Rosanna read them at the table with Eli's cereal bowl still out, moving her finger line by line the way she checked load sheets at 3 a.m. The clause was real. It prohibited retirees from making disparaging statements about the company, its affiliates, and its management, and it tied benefit eligibility to compliance. She read it 4 times. Then she read what it did not say. It did not prohibit stating facts. It did not prohibit confirming employment dates. It said nothing about authenticating documents a retiree had signed in the ordinary course of his own job or answering truthful questions about his own records. Saying the company was rotten was disparagement. Saying this is my signature and this sheet is real was not saying anything about the company at all. Rosanna was not a lawyer, and she knew the difference between reading words and ruling on them. But she also knew the notice Brody received had not quoted the clause. It had only gestured at it and let fear write the rest. She printed the pages at the library when it opened, highlighted the paragraph in yellow, and drove north. Brody met her on the porch and did not invite her in right away, which told her how the visit was going to start. She did not argue. She handed him the printed pages and asked him to read the highlighted paragraph out loud, slowly, the whole thing. He did. Then he read it again silently, standing on his own porch, his thumb moving under the lines. "It says disparaging," he said finally. "It does. Confirming my own signature isn't disparaging anybody." He looked at the yellow highlight a long moment. "They wanted me to think it was." He was quiet, and she let him be quiet, because this was his medication and his wife's knee and his decision. When he spoke again, it came with a condition she had not expected. He would confirm the documents, but not in a phone call, not in a written statement mailed into some transition inbox where it could be lost or answered with another reminder notice. He had gotten one quiet call already, and quiet calls could be repeated until a man changed his mind. "If I'm going to say it, I'll say it where 4,000 people can hear it," Brody said. "On the record, at that town hall. Once it's public, there's nothing left to pressure me out of." Rosanna drove home understanding that she had stopped waiting. For 11 days, some part of her had been waiting. For HR to be reasonable, for the system to hiccup in her favor, and, though she barely admitted it, for the executive at the staff door to remember whatever he had almost remembered. That was over. Nobody upstairs was going to open the file. She would open it for them in the one room where they could not close it quietly. That afternoon, she laid the documents out on the kitchen table and built the order like a checklist. Not the order she had found them, the order the company would be forced to answer them. First, the transition rule itself, in Corvair's own words, 5 years of continuous service qualifies for a staff contract. Their rule, not hers. Second, the Airport Authority Irregularity Report, dated 9 years and 11 months back, her number and signature on it. Third, the printed shift bid sheets, name, number, night, continuous first year. Fourth, Brody standing up to authenticate his own signature. Fifth, the migration batch list, 31 numbers, 1 vendor code, 1 date. Each step answered the objection they would raise against the step before it. She wrote a short script on an index card and timed herself against the kitchen clock. The open question period at the town hall allowed 2 minutes per speaker. Her first read took 3 minutes and 10 seconds. She cut it, read it again, cut it again, until it fit with 8 seconds to spare, then made 1 extra card she did not time and put it at the bottom of the stack. Eli watched her rehearse the third run-through from the doorway, still in his school clothes. When she finished, he didn't say anything about the speech. He went to his room, and she heard the desk drawer open, and he came back with the mentorship acceptance letter slightly creased from living under the spelling lists and put it back on the refrigerator with the magnet shaped like an airplane. "For after," he said. She had planned to leave him with Jamie Lee during the town hall. That plan collapsed at 4 p.m. when Jamie Lee called. Her shift had been moved, nothing she could do. Rosanna looked at the clock, ran through the short list of people she trusted, and reached the end of it in about 4 seconds. Eli was coming with her. There was nowhere else safe to put him, and she was done pretending that fact was anything other than what this whole fight was about. The transition town hall was held in the largest training auditorium at the station, folding chairs to the back wall, a camera platform in the center aisle. This was the flagship event of the transition calendar, live streamed to all 11 Corvair stations, available to roughly 4,000 employees, with the CEO himself attending in person. A screen behind the stage showed the feed grid, break rooms in other cities, rows of vests and coffee cups, all watching the same podium. Tasnim Ballard opened the meeting with the timeline. Rovan Wong sat to her left and spoke for 6 minutes about integration in one company. And if he saw Rosanna in the fifth row, nothing in his face said so. The open question rules appeared on the screen before the microphone opened. 2 minutes per speaker, enforced by a visible countdown timer. Questions should concern the transition generally. Individual scheduling and records matters. Tasnim reminded the room, belonged in the grievance portal. Rosanna heard that sentence for what it was, a door being pre-closed, and stood up anyway. Eli stayed in the third row, backpack at his feet, Brody 2 seats down from him with his hands folded on a manila envelope. Rosanna walked the side aisle with her folder against her chest. The irregularity report, the newsletter photograph, the original shift bid sheets, the migration batch list, and the index cards. The employee at the microphone ahead of her asked about parking lot access and got 40 seconds of answer. Then it was her turn. She stated her name and her employee number. On the screen above the stage, the countdown reset. 2 minutes. The timer started. 120 seconds, Rosanna said. I'll use them on your own rule. She read it from the first card, exactly as it appeared in the transition packet every person in that room had received. Employees with 5 years of continuous service qualify for a staff contract. Not her words. Corvair's words. She said her system record now showed 2 years, and that she was going to spend the rest of her time showing the room where the other 8 went. Tasnim leaned toward her microphone and said evenly that individual records disputes belonged in the grievance portal, not the town hall. Rosanna said she had used the portal twice and had the rejections with her and kept going. The timer read 90 seconds. She held up the irregularity report so the aisle camera could catch it, then laid it flat on the small document stand beneath the lens, where the feed grid behind the stage suddenly showed it in 11 break rooms at once. An official airport authority form, she said, her employee number, her signature, dated 9 years and 11 months ago, time-stamped 2:15 a.m., documenting the escort of a stranded passenger to the standby desk. Not a company record, not touched by any migration, held the whole time by the Front Range Airport Authority, 1 building away from the people who said no record existed. Tasnim's answer came quickly because it was the answer already written in the rejection letter. The authority's archive was a different system, she said. Employee numbers could have been reissued or remapped over a decade. A number on an old form could not be conclusively tied to the person holding that number today. 60 seconds. Then let's tie it, Rosanna said. She slid the printed shift bid sheets under the camera. Paper, yellowed at the staple. The original operator's header across the top. Her name typed in full. Her employee number, the same number, anyone on the live stream could pause and compare, and beside it, in the assignment column, night, continuous. First winter, supervisor signature in the box at the bottom. In the third row, Brody Donnelly stood up. He did not go to a microphone. He said it from where he stood, loud enough, the envelope still in his left hand. My name is Brody Donnelly. I ran night operations at this station for 11 years. I hired Rosanna King. That's my signature on those sheets, and I'll confirm it for any auditor you send. He sat back down. He did not editorialize. He had rehearsed not editorializing, and it showed, and it was somehow more solid than any speech would have been. 30 seconds. At the back of the auditorium, two security staff started down the side aisle, unhurried, the way people move when a countdown is doing the confrontation for them. Glenn Ferguson stood near the stage steps with his arms crossed, and as Rosanna reached for the last document, he said, not quite into any microphone but loud enough for the first 10 rows, that she was embarrassing herself and her son. Eli did not look at Glenn. He looked at his mother. Rosanna placed the migration batch list under the camera. 31 employee numbers, she said. One vendor code, one migration date. This isn't my typo. This is a batch. The timer hit 0, and the microphone went dead in the middle of her next sentence. The auditorium speakers dropped her voice cleanly, professionally, the way the system was designed to do. It did not matter in the way it was meant to matter. The document stand had no timer. The migration list stayed under the lens, filling the feed grid behind the stage. 31 numbers in a column visible in 11 cities. For a few seconds, the room did what rooms do when nobody knows the procedure for what just happened. A chair shifted in the third row. One executive on the stage looked at Tasneem instead of at the audience. Then the live stream chat, projected small in the corner of the feed screen because someone in AV had never imagined a reason to hide it, began to move. An employee at the Salt Lake station posted a badge photo and a hire year. Then one from Albuquerque, then 3 more, then a line that just said, check your dates, and the chat was suddenly scrolling faster than anyone could read it. In the auditorium, a ramp worker in a high-visibility vest stood up at his seat. A woman near the back stood a moment later. Neither of them said anything. They just stood, the way Brody had stood, and stayed standing. Tasneem made the mistake of answering the room honestly. Facing a column of 31 numbers on a public feed, she said that during large migrations, service dates were sometimes normalized to align vendor and operator records, and that normalization was a standard data practice. The word landed in a silence she had not planned for. Because for 12 days, in writing, the company's position had been that service dates were never altered, that the system simply reflected what the records had always said. Rosanna had the rejection letter in her folder saying exactly that. She didn't need to read it aloud. Half the room had received some version of the same letter. Her microphone was still dead. It didn't need to work. She took the last card from the bottom of the stack, the one she had never timed, and slid it under the camera, handwritten in block letters. If I was hired 2 years ago, who signed the incident report with my number on it 10 years ago? Nobody answered it, because there was no answer that left the roster intact. Rovin Wong stood up. He did not go to the podium. He picked up the handheld microphone from the moderator's table, and the room quieted the specific way rooms quiet for the person who signs everything. He asked the AV desk to leave the documents on screen. Then he looked at the irregularity report for a long moment, and when he spoke, he did not sound like the 6 polished minutes from the start of the meeting. 9 years and 11 months ago, he said, a passenger missed the last connection out of this airport. He was 24. His card was declined at the rebooking counter, and his phone was nearly dead, and his mother was in a hospital 1,100 miles away, and he was trying to get to her before the surgery. He paused. A night shift worker found him sitting on the floor of Concourse B at 2 in the morning. She walked him to the standby desk. She stayed until an agent confirmed a seat. Then she went back to work. He looked at Rosanna. I was that passenger. I recognized you at the staff entrance 3 weeks ago. I was almost certain that first night, and I let it sit, because I had a briefing that said your case was one grievance among hundreds, and I chose to believe the briefing. He let that stand as what it was, an admission, and did not decorate it. But I want to be very clear about something, he went on, because it's the reason I waited to say any of this. My memory is not evidence. If we start fixing records based on what executives happen to remember, we're running the same broken process in a friendlier direction. The evidence is that report, which the airport authority held the entire time, 1 building from this room. The evidence is those bid sheets and the supervisor willing to authenticate them. And that migration list is 31 questions this company should have asked itself before it asked anyone to sign an acknowledgement form. He turned toward Tasneem, not unkindly. We could have checked the authorities' archive in an afternoon. We didn't. That's not a systems failure. That's a decision nobody made, which is still a decision. Then he did the only thing his position was actually for. He announced on the record and on the feed that the transition roster was paused pending an independent service record audit conducted by an outside firm reporting outside the station chain and outside the transition HR team. All 31 flagged numbers would be reviewed. No acknowledgement forms would be offered or accepted while records were in dispute. And the confidentiality warning issued to Rosanna King was withdrawn, effective immediately. Nobody applauded. It wasn't that kind of room, and it wasn't that kind of moment. The two standing employees sat down. Somewhere in the chat, badge photos kept scrolling. Rosanna gathered her documents off the stand, squared the pages, and walked back to the fifth row, and Eli moved his backpack so she could sit. What happened next did not happen that night. And it is important that it didn't, because real corrections are slower than town halls. The audit firm arrived the following Monday, 3 people with laptops and a borrowed conference room who interviewed Rosanna for 2 hours and photographed every page she brought. They requested the authorities' full migration index through proper channels, and the access restriction that had blocked her quietly disappeared because an independent auditor with a signed engagement letter was exactly the kind of authorized request the restriction had claimed to exist for. They drove north and sat at Brody Donnelly's kitchen table for an afternoon while he authenticated 14 bid sheets and told them where the old operator's seasonal files used to be stored. One of the auditors mentioned, almost in passing, that this was the point of independent verification. Done properly, it protected workers from erased records and protected companies from paying on false ones, which was why it should have come before any acknowledgement forms, not after. The weeks in between were not suspended in amber. Rosanna kept working nights, reassigned off the de-icing pad and back to the terminal in the second week without ceremony, by a scheduling notice that did not mention why. Eli's audiologist appointment sat on the calendar like a held breath. Jamie Lee kept the couch available and refused the second week's money. The lobby clip aged out of people's feeds. Glenn Ferguson said very little to anyone. The audit report landed 19 days after the town hall. It confirmed Rosanna King's continuous service from her original hire date, 10 years back. Of the 31 flagged employee numbers, 29 were found to have been incorrectly reassigned to the vendor code during migration. Night shift workers across 3 of Corvair's stations, some of whom had already signed acknowledgement forms they should never have been offered. 2 of the 31 had genuinely been agency placements. Their classifications stood. The report recommended, and the company adopted, an independent verification step before any service date could be changed in future migrations, and a rule that no acknowledgement form could be solicited while a record was in dispute. Rosanna's correction came as paperwork, which was the only form she would have trusted. Her original service date, restored, staff contract status, family health coverage, retroactive to the start of the transition, which mattered because the audiologist's office needed exactly 1 phone call to confirm it, fixed night scheduling, in writing this time, back differential pay for the misclassified period, and a correction payment that cleared the overdue rent with enough left over to fix the car's heater, enough to close a hole, not enough to change a life, which was proportionate to what had actually been taken. Rovin's office offered her a position in the new operations group, daytime hours, a desk, a title. She turned it down in a 2-line reply, because daytime was the one thing she had spent 10 years refusing to sell. The mornings belonged to a school door and always had. She accepted the other offer instead, night shift training lead for the station. It came with a pay grade and a badge designation, and it was not a gift. And everyone on the ramp knew it wasn't because it was the job she had already been doing without the title for 6 years. Two of the day supervisors she'd trained signed the internal recommendation. Her acknowledgement to Rovin's office was one sentence. The correction was the right action, and she appreciated that it was done properly. She did not thank him for remembering her. Remembering had never been the problem. Glenn Ferguson was not fired on a stage because that is not how any of this actually works. He was reassigned pending the second phase of the audit, which examined how acknowledgement forms had been presented at his station, whether disputing workers had been pressured or punished, and why an employee raising a records dispute had been moved to the remote pad. Whatever that review concluded, it concluded in an office on paper the same way the damage had been done. Eli's liability form went through the mentorship office in 4 days. Once the parent employment line verified cleanly, his replacement ear molds were fitted 3 weeks after the audit report by the same audiologist who adjusted the left aid twice and told him to stop growing so fast. He put the little brush back in the case in the parking lot, checked the seal the way he always did, and asked if they could get food on the way home, which was how Rosanna knew everything had actually landed. The mentorship open house was on a Saturday. In a hangar, the authority lent the program, with a retired regional jet parked at one end and folding tables of pamphlets at the other. Eli wore his program lanyard. During the ramp operations demonstration, a mentor ran the group through marshalling signals, and Eli's hands moved through them before the mentor finished explaining: stop, turn left, slow down, chocks in, clean and automatic. Another student asked how he already knew all of them. Eli pointed across the hangar to where Rosanna stood near the coffee table. She taught me. The aftermath held to 3 things, and only 3. 29 service records were restored across 3 stations, with back differential pay where the misclassification had cost wages. The company's independent verification step became permanent policy for all future migrations, and any employee could now challenge a migrated record without first signing anything that accepted the disputed date. The acknowledgement forms, as they had been used, were retired. Then it was winter again, which at that airport only ever means it is still winter, and it was 11:40 p.m. at the staff entrance. Rosanna King tapped her badge against the reader. The light turned green on the first tap, and the small display beneath it, which she had never once looked at in the years when it lied, showed her service date the way the system now carried it: 10 years. She held the door. Eli stepped up beside her. Saturday night mentorship shadow session, authorized on the schedule, and tapped his own badge against the reader. His first, the program's junior credential with his name printed under the wing logo. 2 green lights, 11 minutes apart from nothing, at the same door where a red one had started all of it. So here is the last question, and it belongs to you. Rovin Wong stood up that night and said the right things, that his memory wasn't evidence, that the archive had been sitting there all along, that the company had failed to look. All of it true. But he recognized Rosanna at that door 3 weeks before he said a word, and he accepted the comfortable briefing, and he found his voice only after 4,000 employees were watching a column of 31 numbers scroll across a live stream he could not switch off. So which was it? A powerful man finally doing his job, or a powerful man doing it only once, forgetting had become publicly impossible?
10 years finally turned green. Comment your thoughts and subscribe to Malric Coleman for more hard-earned justice.